video. Okay, where we left off, Darwin argued that nature did essentially the same thing that breeders did, that the environment determined, at least in part, which individuals survived to have babies and which did not. You will get people sometimes who will tell you that they can't believe in evolution because it says that everything is totally random. That's not actually factually true. Natural selection is not random. It basically states that, the choice of which individuals reproduce and which don't is not a random choice. It depends on the traits that those individuals have. Individuals with certain traits have greater chances of leaving offspring than individuals that don't have those traits. It's not a random process at all. To an extent, it's mathematically predictable, and we'll get into that by the end of this week. The usual objection that I get at this stage is to say that selection, okay, you can create new breeds of pigeon or dog or cat or tomato or pepper or what have you, but it can't create new kinds of living things. The problem here is that whenever somebody uses the word kind, they're probably intending to move the goalpost, because exactly what you mean by kind is often not defined very well. What exactly is a kind? Well, here's two wild species. They're in different genera. They're both in the pigeon family, and you can tell they're similar to each other. The main difference that you can see is that the pink-necked fruit dove on the right has this pink head, whereas the common rock pigeon tends to have kind of a slate gray head. But they're about the same size. They're about the same beak shape. They're generally the same body proportions, more or less. Clearly, these are very similar birds. And Darwin asks, he doesn't mention this particular species, but he raises the question, which would be more different from each other? The rock pigeon and the pink-necked fruit dove, which we classify as not just separate species, but separate genera, or the yellow Brunner pouter and the Ackerman tumbler, which are breeds of fancy pigeon that have been produced over just a few hundred years by artificial selection. The yellow Brunner pouter is one of these ones that inflates the upper part of its digestive tract, so it looks a little bit like a feathery lollipop. The Ackerman tumbler is one of the somersaulting ones with this very beautiful color pattern and a little ruff of reversed feathers on its neck. Which look more different from each other, these wild species or those? Or try it again. There's the wild rock pigeon on the left. On the right is an endangered species from the Philippines called the bleeding heart pigeon. Has that patch of red feathers on its breast, but other than that, they're roughly the same size, same beak shape, generally the same color. They both got bars on the wings. So clearly very much like each other, recognizable as pigeons. So which are more similar to each other? These two wild species that we put in different genera, or a black fantail compared to an old Dutch capuchin, which are fancy breeds of pigeon. And we know, we've got records of this, that all of these fancy pigeons are the descendants of that common rock pigeon. But Darwin argues that if you could take a black fantail and an old Dutch capuchin, or two other sufficiently weird-looking fancy breeds, and if you could somehow put them in front of a specialist who wasn't familiar with pigeons and tell him that they're wild species, that ornithologist would probably classify them as separate species. at least a score of pigeons, that's 20 varieties, a score is 20, might be chosen, which if shown to an ornithologist and he were told that they were wild birds, would certainly, I think, be ranked by him as well-defined species. Moreover, I do not believe that any ornithologist would place the English carrier, the short-faced tumbler, the runt, the barb, pouter, and fantail in the same genus. There's no real difference in kind between natural species and artificial varieties. Darwin argued the only real difference is that the artificial varieties are still connected by intermediates. You can find pigeon varieties that are less extreme than the black fantail and the old Dutch capuchin, and they're still around today. But if all of the pigeons in the world got wiped out except for the black fantail and the old Dutch capuchin, it would be much easier to classify them as separate species because you no longer have evidence of forms that are somewhere in the middle between these two. So his argument is that what we call natural species, the in-between forms, have died out. In artificial varieties, the intermediates are still around. And natural selection seemed to explain a lot more biological facts as well, not just, artificial and natural selection. As he put it, a naturalist reflecting on the mutual affinities of organic beings, that means the ways in which they're similar, their embryological relations, their geographical distribution, geological succession, and other such facts, might come to the conclusion that each species had not been independently created, but had descended, like varieties, from other species. So what I'm about to show you is not something that Darwin himself discovered. Most of these had been found decades before he was working. But Darwin puts them all together and says the best explanation for all of these is evolution, probably by natural selection. So for example, in the middle, that's the bones of a human hand. On the right, that's a seal flipper. On the left, a bat wing. Very different functions. Duh, bat wings are for flying. Seal flippers are for swimming. The human hands are for playing Rachmaninoff piano concertos or what have you. Human hands do a huge number of different things. And yet you could match them bone for bone. You can't see this quite as well in the bat wing, but if you look carefully at the human hand and the seal flipper, they've got exactly the same arrangement of bones. The seal flipper even has one fewer bone in the thumb. That's the digit on the left-hand side compared to the other four phalanges on the right. And, right, you could draw lines. I won't do this too much. This is kind of scribble scratch, but you could match up each bone in one with the corresponding bone in the other. And it's not as obvious on the bat wing because this is, not high enough resolution, but you could do the same thing with the wing of the bat as well. Oh, what the heck, right? There's that thumb and there's the next joint and there's that one and so on. If you allow for some bones being lost, you could do the same thing with a pig's trotter or a dog's foot or a cat's foot, a lizard foot, even a horse's hoof. All across the land vertebrates, you find variations on one common structure. That was actually first named not by Darwin, but by an expert by the name of Robert Owen, who coined a word for this relationship called homology, a term you might have heard before. Darwin asked the question, why? why should things as different as your hand and the flipper of a seal be built using identical arrangements of bones, just different in proportions a bit? Well, maybe, just maybe, I'll just throw this out here, your hand and a seal flipper look the same because they inherited the same patterns of bones from a common ancestor, which was neither a human nor a seal. And there's Richard Owen, so vain about his education that all of his portraits are him wearing his academic gown. Kind of a annoying, well, okay, here's a better story. Owen was the curator of a museum at the Royal College of Surgeons. So he had this big anatomical museum. He worked out a deal with the London Zoo that he would get to dissect and preserve any exotic animals that died while in captivity. The usual way to get a skeleton was to boil the body until the flesh all dropped off, which makes Richard Owen's wife one of the most patient women in world history when she woke up and found that her husband was boiling a dead rhino in the basement. Apparently, boiling rhino does not smell good at all. If you ever see rhino soup on the menu, you should probably just get the chicken. Anyway, so Owen, who had an enormous amount of experience with the anatomy of exotic animals, had already written that all vertebrates were variations on one common plan that could be modified for different functions, but was still fundamentally the same. Owen coined a word for this kind of similarity of structure. It's the word homology. Darwin argued that you could explain why you have homology by an appeal to evolution, an appeal to common ancestry. Then there's the question of vestigial structures. This is my personal favorite. Mammals have muscles that wiggle their external ears. You've seen cats do this. They'll flick their ears if there's a fly or a flea in them. They'll raise their ears to be curious, or fold their ears back if they're angry, or swivel their ears around to try to catch a sound that they can't, to pinpoint where it's coming from. Dogs do this. They'll indicate emotion and also try to pick sounds up by moving their ears. Horses and cows do this. Lots of mammals do this. You have muscles that you can use to wiggle your external ears. They're right there. They're 3 auricularis muscles. Here's the thing, you've got them. Most people never learn to use them. In a class this size, maybe one person will be able to wiggle his or her ears. I can't. My nervous system has just never really worked out how to make those auricularis muscles move. I could probably have these surgically removed and never even notice they were missing. And ear wiggling makes no difference to survival. I'm not going to ask anybody to tell stories, but I'm willing to bet nobody has been in a situation where the only thing that saved you from certain death was the ability to wiggle your ears. Okay. Yeah, some of us wish we could wiggle our ears. I certainly can't, but it makes no practical difference. You know, I'm not prepared to say no one has been in this situation because there's all kinds of things on the internet, but I'm guessing nobody's been in a situation where they encountered a prospective romantic partner who said, I love you. I want to have lots and lots of babies with you. I am handsome and very wealthy and will give you an amazing life and will love you forever. But I just can't get interested unless you can wiggle your ears. I'm guessing that cannot have happened terribly often. So ear wiggling makes no difference that I can detect to whether you live or die or whether you reproduce or not. Why do you have these muscles that you can't use? Well, Darwin would say because you inherited them from a distant common ancestor that was not modern humans, that did wiggle its ears because it needed to. You've lost the need, but you still have the muscles. So these structures are kind of like my great grandmother's table lamp that my mother thinks is so ugly, but has never been able to quite get rid of. That's called a vestigial structure. Then there's the whole field of biogeography, the study of the distribution of animals and plants. How do you explain the Galapagos? Why are there 14 species of finch in the Galapagos Islands? Okay, technically 13 in the Galapagos and 1 on Cocos Island, which is a bit to the north. Why are they found nowhere but the Galapagos? Why are they similar to finches that you could find on the South American mainland, like the common grassquit, and yet not the same? Why do they have adaptations that mimic species that you'd find elsewhere? Why do you have finches with parrot-like beaks, but not parrots? Why do you have finches with long beaks that probe in rotten wood like flickers, but you don't have any flickers? You know, why does the same thing apply to the tortoises and the hawks and the prickly pear cactus and all that? Then there's the study of embryos. This had already been pointed out by scientists like Carl von Baer and Louis Agassiz. I'll come back to Agassiz later, that species that might look very different as adults looked very similar if you opened their eggs and looked at the embryos. So for example, this is a diagram. It's simplified a little bit. You're not seeing the blood vessels running to the yolk sac. But that's more or less a turtle embryo over there on the left at a very early stage. And there's a chicken embryo on the right. I think that's about 72 hours after laying. Might be a little later than that. It's been a while since I studied this. And turtles and chickens obviously look very different as adults. And yet these embryos are almost impossible to tell apart. They've both got these little paddle-like flippers. They've both got these clefts in the neck region. These are the so-called pharyngeal clefts. They've both got these tissue blocks called the somites running down the long axis of the body. These things that look like little rectangles there. And it's only at a later stage that the turtle embryo is beginning to develop a shell, and the chicken isn't. And that raises the question, why? If turtles and chickens are so different as adults, why do they come from embryos that are almost identical? I mean, for that matter, there was a stage when you didn't look all that different. There were some differences, but not major ones. You looked kind of like this chick embryo right here. Why? And then there's the fossils. Darwin had already noticed that there were fossils that blended characters of what we would now call very separate groups. This is a South American beast called Macrauchenia, which looks a little bit like what you'd get if you crossed a rhino, an elephant, and a giraffe. You know, you do know what you get when you cross an elephant and a rhino. The answer, of course, is Elephino. But we've already talked about, I showed you that picture of Toxodon, which Darwin noticed seemed to blend features of what we now call separate groups. And then there's that whole business about South American fossils looking hauntingly similar to living distinctive South American species. Why? Why do you have that? So he puts all this together probably does the greatest job that anybody had done before of coming up with evidence that evolution had taken place. And argues more to the point that he not only has evidence that evolution took place, he's got a mechanism for what's causing it, and that's natural selection. He didn't go public right away, partly because the political and religious climate was a bit conservative at the time. Darwin was not actually out to destroy religion. And remember, he had been trained as a minister and knew the Bible very well. He ended up losing his faith at about this time, mostly as a fairly gradual process, but he certainly never meant to attack it, but he knew that people would take it that way. There was social risk in putting forward ideas that were more than many people would be able to follow. There's also the fact that the dominant ideas of how you ought to do science valued fact gathering, not coming up with hypotheses. Instead of resorting, people didn't use the hypothetico-deductive method at the time. This whole formulate hypothesis, gather data, test the hypothesis that we've all learned about. And they tended to value fact gathering more. You gather lots of facts and then you try to arrive at a conclusion by induction. There was a book that came out in 1844 that did present evolutionary ideas, was anonymously published. It was called Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, and it caused a scandal. Darwin wanted to avoid that. Darwin was kind of averse to conflict. This is Darwin with his first son, by the way. If it looks like he's wearing a dress, the answer is he is. It used to be very common for children of both sexes to wear dresses or gowns, certainly until they could take care of their own toilet needs, because it's a lot easier to change a baby in a gown than a baby in pants. But yeah, this was typical at the time. So he spent over 20 years gathering facts that might have some bearing on the origin of species. Remember, he also has this chronic disease, and he wasn't sure he was going to live to be old. As it turned out, he did live a full lifespan. He was over 70 when he died, but he was afraid he was going to die before he was able to get all of this out to the public. And he wrote a couple of sketches laying out his theories in 1842 and 1844. The 1844 sketch he left with his wife with a sum of money to get this published so that in case he died, he would at least get posthumous credit for his big idea. As it turns out, he didn't die, and the sketches weren't published in his lifetime. He worked on various projects, and then by 1858, he was puttering away at what probably would have been a massive 3-volume work that would have laid everything out in full detail. And he gets a letter from a guy named Alfred Russel Wallace, this man. Wallace came from a very different background. He was from an impoverished background and making a living as a professional collector, going off to exotic tropical places, collecting insects and birds and mammals and seashells and things like that, and selling them back in England to museums and wealthy private collectors. And he'd been collecting insects in Malaysia, and he'd had this idea while recuperating from a bout of malarial fever, sitting there in his hammock. He'd hit upon ideals that were identical to Darwin's. He'd noticed a lot of the same things that Darwin had, that different islands in Malaysia had different species of beetle, that the shapes of his beetles were correlated with the kind of lifestyle that the beetle had, just as surely as the shapes of Darwin's finches' beaks are correlated with the lifestyle that they had. So he'd noticed a lot of the same things. As we will see, tropical islands, be they the Galapagos or Hawaii or French Polynesia or Malaysia, are awesome places to see the effects of the evolutionary process. We'll talk about that roughly 2/3 of the way through this course. And he wrote a letter laying this out, and he sent it to Darwin, who was, by this time, had published multiple books and was recognized as an authority. And Darwin was absolutely floored because he thought he was about to get scooped. As he wrote, "I never saw a more striking coincidence. If Wallace had my manuscript sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better short abstract. So all my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed." Okay, so what to do? Darwin's been working on these ideas for over 20 years, and he doesn't go public with them, but there's a small circle of friends that know what he's up to. Charles Lyell, by this stage, was one of them, the guy who came up with uniformitarianism. They became friends, and Darwin let Lyell in on the secret of what he was thinking about. And Darwin's friends brokered a compromise with Wallace. In 1858, excerpts from Wallace's letter and some extracts from Darwin's writings were cut and pasted together and published as a jointly authored scientific paper that essentially allows both people to claim a share of the credit. And Wallace really should get more recognition than I think he does as a co-discoverer of the idea of natural selection. Now, I've come across writers that argued that Wallace was cheated, that Darwin and his friends, it was a conspiracy to cheat Wallace out of his rightful share of the credit. And Wallace should be remembered as having a share in the credit for coming up with natural selection. Wallace would go on to make some very important contributions of his own that we'll talk about towards the end of this course. But Darwin's friends knew that he'd been working on this for 21 years. He'd had the idea first, and they did want to see him get recognition for 21 years of work on it. So Darwin quickly took the book that he'd been writing, trimmed it to a manageable length, to a single book of about 400 pages instead of what probably would have been what they called a three-decker in those days, a big 3-volume book that nobody would have read. And he trimmed it down and published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection in December of 1859. The first printing The first printing sold out on the day it was published. By the standards of scientific books, it was a bestseller. All kinds of people read it, not just scientists. And it lays out all of this natural selection stuff. Now, Darwin says almost nothing about human evolution in Origin of Species. I remember reading the reviews on Amazon years ago, and there was somebody who had bought the book expecting that from the beginning, Darwin was going to deliver this, two-fisted, double-barreled blast against God and Jesus and morality and motherhood and apple pie and the American flag. Was waiting for some kind of, savage attack, and read the first chapter and found out that it's all about pigeons and was like, what the hell? This is not what I was expecting. The only real place where Darwin mentions the idea that humans evolved is in 2 sentences almost at the very end, where he's talking about advances that will be made once his views are more widely accepted. And he says something like, the science of psychology will be placed on a more sound footing once we can discover how the faculties of the mind are acquired by gradation light will be thrown on the origin of man and on his ancestry. Other than that, he says virtually nothing about humans. Oh, one thing I should mention, if you look at the cover, the full title of the book is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. And I've had people online and occasionally in person flip their lid over this phrase, the preservation of favored races, because favored races sounds, like the sort of thing the Nazis would say. The truth is that I'll talk about race in just a bit, but the truth is that when Darwin writes about race, he's not writing about human races at all. He says virtually nothing about humans in this book. And I went and checked this myself. When he uses the word races, in one case, he mentions races of cabbages. In another, it's races of dogs. He's basically using the word just to mean variety. And usually not using the word to mean different varieties of humans at all. So if you ever encounter somebody using that argument, challenge them to read the actual book instead of just the title page. Anyway, even though Darwin had not directly said anything about human evolution, it did not take long for people to realize that if this were true, it had some rather unflattering implications. There's a cartoon in 1861 with a gorilla asking the question, am I a man and a brother? Dun, dun, dun. Notice the date on that, 1861. There's a little backstory behind this cartoon. The point of that cartoon is that Darwin and his family had always been anti-slavery activists. It was a big deal, not just for Darwin, but his father and his grandparents. There was no slavery in England itself at the time, or in Great Britain, I should say, the United Kingdom. There we go. There was no slavery in the United Kingdom itself. There'd been a court decision in 1757 that barred it. If you were an American plantation owner or something like that, and you took your slaves with you to Britain, they were freed the minute they set foot on British soil. Britain still did tolerate it in some of its colonies. Certainly in the North American colonies, there was slavery, as you know. It was also going on in places like British Suriname. Remember the former slave who'd been freed, John Edmonstone, who taught Charles Darwin taxidermy. It was also going on in Jamaica at the time. But in 1807, Britain started using its navy to block the slave trade. They spent a lot of money and time building up the West Africa Squadron of the British Navy, stopping, searching, and sailing ships, and in many cases setting the slaves free in a region of Africa called Sierra Leone, still a country now. Darwin had always hated this, and he'd seen it firsthand in Brazil on the Beagle voyage. In fact, it was one of the few things that he really argued about with Captain Fitzroy. I've mentioned that Darwin was very easy to get along with, just an amazingly nice guy. Fitzroy had a hell of a temper on him. In fact, Darwin and Fitzroy would have breakfast every morning. And after breakfast, the officers would discreetly ask Darwin if they'd had any hot coffee. Hot coffee was the code word for, is Fitzroy pissed off about something? That was his temper, was his hot coffee. Fitzroy also didn't see anything wrong with slavery. He figured it was natural. And Darwin and Fitzroy, early in the voyage, visited a plantation in Brazil. And they were discussing this. And the plantation owner called all of the slaves into the room and said, "Do you like slavery?" And the slaves all smiled and said, "Yes, we love it here. It's great. It's terrific. We didn't like that stupid freedom anyway. We're having a great time here, and this guy treats us really, really well." And Fitzroy said, "Well, there, you see, slavery is natural and the slaves are happy." And Darwin said, in effect, "Look, dude, the owner who could have them all beaten was standing right there. Do you really think they're going to tell the truth?" And Fitzroy said, "Are you calling me a liar?" And they broke up for a while. And they eventually became friends again by kind of agreeing that they'd never speak of this. But Darwin was revolted by it. He'd heard the screams of slaves being whipped in Brazil. He'd seen the chains. He thought it was degrading not just to the slaves, but the slave owners. And as he wrote, "These deeds are done and palliated by men who profess to love their neighbors as themselves, who believe in God and pray that his will be done on earth. It makes one's blood boil, yet heart tremble, to think that we Englishmen and our American descendants, with their boastful cry of liberty, have been and are so guilty." So what does that have to do with this cartoon that I showed you, with the gorilla asking, "Am I a man and a brother?" Darwin's grandfather, whose daughter married Robert Darwin's son, was a potter named Josiah Wedgwood. Wedgwood was a pioneer of industrial production techniques. And I don't know how many of you are really into this, but Wedgwood China is a very old name, and people collect this stuff because Wedgwood used chemistry to work out how to produce lots of china and how to produce new colors and new glazes and new designs and things like that. And he made a lot of money in that business. People still collect Wedgwood china today. And Wedgwood had also been passionately against slavery and committed money towards abolition societies. And to raise money, he'd created this china plaque showing a kneeling slave in chains, holding up his hands. And the caption, as you see, is, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This got really popular. People bought these, put them in their houses. This was how memes worked before the invention of the internet. This was a very well-known image, and it was associated with Darwin and his family. And so the joke behind that cartoon is Darwin is raising the very uncomfortable possibility that not just Africans, but even gorillas might be brothers of us proper Englishmen. The English pride themselves on having proper breeding, and yet, oh dear, good heavens, perhaps we are related to certain individuals that one might not wish one were. Harumph. As someone, things really heated up when Darwin did get around to publishing his views on human evolution. He published a book called The Descent of Man, laying out what was known at the time about human ancestry in 1871. In 1872, he published a book called The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, in which he argued that not just human bodies, but human minds had their own homologies with animal minds. And, not just our bodies, but our capacities to feel. Those were not unique to humanity. They had homologs, if you like, throughout the animal kingdom. That monkeys really could feel, not just pain and things like that, but could really feel, happiness, humor, sorrow, grief, all of these deep emotions that we tend to think of as being human traits alone, they're present in the animal kingdom too. They're not unique to us. Their minds are similar to ours. That really got the controversy going. Supposedly, some Victorian lady said, "Descended from apes? My dear, let us hope it is not true. But if it is, let us pray that it will not become generally known." That's the sort of thing you might say if you find that your great 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 grandfather was, I don't know, some criminal bank robber or something like that. Let us hope it is not true, but let us pray that it will not become generally known. Harumph. And I want to go back a little bit to talking about human races, because that has been very much a subject in the forefront, well, for a very long time, but it seems especially pressing with everything from, the murder of George Floyd to the recent commemorations of the Tulsa massacre of 1921. This is something that as a country, the United States is having to confront a lot more than I think many are comfortable with. Darwin sometimes gets attacked today for being a racist, or even in some cases being the inspiration for Hitler. I listened to the entirety of Glenn Beck's radio show on August 20th, 2010, so that you didn't have to. And I transcribed this directly from the show. Glenn Beck actually said, "Charles Darwin is the father of modern day racism, a horrible racist, the father of the Holocaust." As I mentioned, you have to read carefully, because when Darwin uses the word race, he's not necessarily talking about people at all. He talks about races of cabbage in The Origin of Species. Clearly, that's not, what we're talking about here. And let's be clear, one of the problems with the study of history is that all too often it gets used to identify heroes and villains. When I was a kid, Columbus was a great hero because he was a bold sailor, who set forth in his 3 ships and, bravely sailed across the Atlantic and discovered a whole new world. We sang this song. He sailed and sailed and sailed and sailed on the Nina Pinta Santa Maria until at last he found this land. He found this land for you and me. Sorry, but I remember learning that in, I think, the 2nd grade. And of course, now Columbus is getting torn down as a villain because what he was a gold-greedy, genocidal, child sex-abusing maniac who got arrested because he was so cruel in his rule of the Caribbean islands that the government of Spain said, "Hey, wait, dude," and this is Spain at the time of the Spanish Inquisition. And for them to say, "Hey, you're being too cruel," that's pretty significant. So Columbus has gone from being a hero to a villain. Confederate soldiers have gone from being bold defenders who fought for what they believed in, to defenders of a wicked slave-holding empire. So they too have gone from heroes to villains, and there's a lot of argument over this, as you know if you've watched any news in the past year. When you're actually studying history, it's not really history's job to find people for you to cheer and boo. Most people are mixtures of good and bad, and you kind of have to take people in the context of their time. So I'm not telling you these things about Darwin to make you either think he was a great saint or a great sinner. Darwin was in many ways a very typical Englishman of the 19th century, and probably one who, if you'd asked, would have admitted that being white and English and having lots of money at the time when the British Empire is growing, that's pretty much the top of the human heap. I doubt he would have really deep down inside felt himself to be equal with a Fuegian. And you can certainly find passages in his books that would not pass muster. He tends to throw the words savage around entirely too often for comfort. So here he's speculating on the chief causes of the low morality of savages, the confinement of sympathy to the same tribe, insufficient powers of reasoning, they're not smart enough, and weak power of self-command. He means self-control. For this power has not been strengthened through long continued, perhaps inherited habit, instruction, and religion. Right, you cannot get away with saying things like that today. So if you want to go quote mining, you can certainly find passages that to suggest that Darwin was not woke. All right, so it goes. You have to set that against the fact that by the standards of the middle 1800s, Darwin was pretty damn woke, because he makes a powerful argument that there are no unbridgeable differences between human races and ethnicities and societies, that they all share a common ancestry. And he'd learned this from his experiences. And this is why I mentioned John Edmonstone. Darwin wrote, the American Aborigines, Negros, and Europeans differ as much from each other in mind as any three races that can be named. Yet I was incessantly struck while living with the Fuegians on board the BIOL with the many little traits of character showing how similar their minds were to ours. And so it was with a full-blooded Negro with whom I happened once to be intimate. He means friendly, by the way. It was not a sexually intimate relationship as far as anyone can now tell. But he'd actually gotten to know an African and some native South Americans well enough to see that his mind was fundamentally like theirs. There wasn't that much difference between them, not a difference that you couldn't bridge. By the standards of the time, that's damn progressive. And you have to remember that there was a competing theory at the time called polygenism. An American named Samuel George Morton had spent a good chunk of the early 1800s collecting skulls from every racial group that he could get skulls from and measuring their size and shape. And he'd concluded, first of all, that the human races were in fact separate species. And second of all, that in the ladder of superiority, white people were on top with the biggest brains. His ideas were popularized by a couple of authors named Josiah Nott and somebody Glidden, who published this book in America in the 1850s. Notice the timeline. Notice what's going on. Notice that this book was very popular in the American South. So over here, you've got, that's a Greek statue with a Caucasian skull right there. And you notice they've got these humongous brain and this high forehead. Compare that over here to, this is labeled a Creole Negro right here. This is an African guy with a skull with a sloping forehead and jaws sticking out. Compare that to a young chimpanzee down here at the bottom, which also has this sloping forehead and the jaw sticking out. I should mention, by the way, that part of this is an optical illusion because the skull of the African over here has been deliberately tipped backwards to make the forehead look sloping and the jaws protrude. Whereas the white person's skull is not only upright, it's also been turned slightly So you don't see the jaws protruding because the skull is looking a little bit towards you instead of you seeing it in straight on profile. And this book argued that the physical differences and the mental differences were so great that the human races had separate origins. Whoever, Adam and Eve was the ancestor of white people only. We don't know where those Africans came from, but it sure as heck wasn't them. And if the human races are separate species, then enslaving people of different races isn't really different from, domesticating cows or horses. We make cows and horses work for us. Why shouldn't we make Africans work for us? I see no problem there. That's what Darwin was competing against. Human races are separate species, separate origins, and people who, humans may look like they're the same, but if they ain't white, they ain't us kind of people. Oh, there's some more drawings right there comparing monkeys to Africans down there. That's what Darwin's competing with. Darwin's contemporary, a guy named Louis Agassiz, was a Swiss-born professor who by this time was at Harvard. He'd never seen people of African descent in Switzerland because Switzerland, Switzerland makes mayonnaise look dark. And he'd come to America and been served by waiters in a Philadelphia hotel, and he freaked because he'd never been up close to people of African descent before. And I couldn't even stand to quote the whole letter. He freaks out that they've got curly hair and dark skin and they're handling my food. It's just awful. And as he writes, I experienced pity at the sight of this degraded and degenerate race, and their lot inspired compassion in me. Nonetheless, it is impossible for me to reprocess the feeling that they are not of the same blood as us. So respected scientists with data behind them are arguing that Africans aren't the same kind of people as us. Darwin says that they are, that holy cow, as different as you might seem from an African or a Native American, or, Darwin had met Polynesians on his trip as well. As different as it might seem, we all share the fundamentally same body and mind. That's a powerful argument for equality. Darwin's not perfect. You can find lots of passages that, would not be acceptable in discourse now. By the standards of the 19th century, Darwin's heart is very much in the right place. Darwin was cheering on the North in the American Civil War, writing letters to American scientists where he made no secret of this. And that kinship extends not just to the human races, but to the rest of the animal kingdom. As Darwin concluded in his book, The Descent of Man, we must acknowledge that man, with all his noble qualities, with sympathy which feels for the most debased, with benevolence which extends not only to other men, but to the humblest living creature, with his godlike intellect, he's talking about me here, with all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. None of us have any real reason to be too proud. That's the end of this slideshow, so that's a good place for me to stop the recording, and I'll stop it right now.